We were about to eat the food, and I noticed my room is trashed. And then all of a sudden, he goes out and comes back in and starts hitting us and tells his girlfriend to go grab the bat. And I see her come in with the bat, and the first thing she does is hit me across my back. He was acting very different today. He was acting calm, rather than like he has anger issues, I would say.
What about this chick?
She was very calm. She didn't act like anything out of the ordinary. I'm not sure if you know already, but he has previous criminal charges, and my mom's still paying his bail right now.
What were they for?
Going into vehicles and taking people's things.
I think anytime there's the concept of an unprovoked attack, the idea of unpredictable violence is something that's very unsettling for anybody. The fact that this attack appeared to be out of the blue and unprovoked is by itself very worrisome. When you add the layer that he's already got charges, he's got a history of criminality, that's what brings the question of psychopathy into it. Often individuals will start out with lower level crimes and then graduate, as it were, to more severe things, including an escalation of violence.
These individuals have been duct taped and dragged and beaten with blunt objects. There is a level of savagery here that's unexpected given the profile that these two individuals, Wendy and Randall Bjorge, of being people who were pillars of the community. There's a distinct odor of bleach that was meant to mask the smell of a corpse, right? It looked like that there was a party there. It's disturbing on its face because it shows again that whoever did this crime flaunted it. They wanted to take what was the Bjorges and use it for their own selves, and they wanted to dance on the graves of these two bodies.
On Saturday, police found the bodies of the grandparents inside their furlong run home. A short time later, authorities were finally able to track down Bjorg and Ryder. Police say the two tried to kill themselves as a SWAT team surrounded them.
Can it tell me, fill me up what's been going on? How you got here?
Like, there's just a lot of tension between, me and my grandparents. Like, I couldn't take it anymore. Like, I just honestly, I just hated my life, Like, I didn't know what to do. Like, my grandparents, I didn't know what to do with them. I didn't know what to do with my parents, and school, everything just started exploding, and then it just created more explosions, and
So what we know about Cassie Bjorge here is that she's no stranger to law enforcement. She has a history of early behavior problems, running away for days at a time, not getting along with her mother, having the police called her house 31 times. She's describing her woes in life, her troubles, her challenges. And I think that's because she's setting the stage for a possible excuse of why this all happened. She's just not taking any responsibility and creating a new narrative, which could possibly be a defense for her.
Be honest about everything. Sweetie, be honest about everything. I think you know why I'm here.
I wasn't the one who intentionally thought about doing that.
How about doing what?
Say it. Once you say it, it's out.
Killing my grandparents.
You willing to talk about, I guess,
Yeah.
what happened, starting from when you ran away, I guess? Is that the 31st? Do you remember, or 28th or something like that?
I didn't really run away. My grandma kicked me out.
What's interesting is that we see Cassie Bior's body language and even the range of emotion be very shallow. She's very conversational. She's very matter of fact. This is such a violent crime, violent offense. 2 people murdered, her grandparents at that, and she has really no emotion, no remorse about it. She's just so willing to talk about her story with officers, probably because she wants to have it heard.
So so I guess when do you decide to go back to your grandparents' house in the middle of the night?
We went to Peace Ridge Park and we talked about it. At first, it wasn't my idea at first.
How did you even get, I guess, what was said? How did you even bring up, what was the context?
He first asked me, "Are you afraid to die?" And I said no. And then I asked him, "Are you afraid to die?" And he said no. And he was just talking about how we could run away together, that kind of dream. And he asked me, he was like, "Would you kill your grandparents?" It's it started getting really bad, I got a charge from him. They didn't look at me the same anymore.
I think what happens here is you see on full display the disconnect that Cassie has with understanding how much of a problem her behavior has been and taking any responsibility for that. Instead, how she perceives all of these mishaps is that she's been rejected by her grandparents. She's the victim here. Probably because her ego can't, handle the fact that she did wrong.
So we decided to go around midnight or 1:30 because my grandma normally went to sleep around 11:30, 12.
What would you guys do next? How'd you move up to the house?
The back deck.
Did you guys have anything in your hands, or you just
Yeah,
hit
a
to
tire
fix
iron.
it?
It was a
Okay.
tire iron. And Johnny just used his fist, and he brought a black book bag that had duct tape in it, and it had the tire iron in it, and it had gloves in it because we were also wearing gloves too. I go upstairs. He goes into my grandpa's room, and then I go into my grandpa's room. He started going at it, and then I could hear my grandpa just yelling, them fighting, and then I started getting the rush, and then that's when I started hitting my grandma in the head.
So you took the tire iron, is it just...
I started just beating her head with it.
The back of the head?
Yeah. And I already had duct tape, and then, Johnny's doing his thing. And, I stopped hearing Johnny doing whatever. And so he comes in the room with me and my grandma, and, he helps me, tie up my grandma with the duct tape. And I got her hands, I got her whole head, and then I got her ankles. We kind of wrapped the duct tape around her head-ish. So, and then that was it.
There's an eerie feeling that you get when you listen to her describe this act, because it's cold, it's detached, it's calculated. She is feeding off of the emotional state that she is experiencing. She is enjoying it. She's literally having a good time doing this.
And then I dragged her into my grandpa's room, and then Johnny asked me to go get some knives. So I got some knives from downstairs in the kitchen, and I got 3 like, big butcher knives. And then that's when he started like stabbing my grandpa, because then I went back upstairs because I dragged my grandma into my grandpa's room, so they were both in there. So we just brought her into the bathroom. And then, yeah. And then Johnny slit her throat too. And I actually hit her in the back of the head with the tire iron. Well, not the back of the head, but like right where your spine is. Because he was telling me, he was like, if you hit right there, like just one like good hit, you can just knock the person out and then they'll be dead. It was kind of creepy because she was like scared to die. Like she herself, repeating herself.
Oh, did she?
It was kind of gross.
Part of the narcissistic traits that are very prominent here is Cassie dehumanizing her grandmother. You know, she makes the comment, it's so gross that she peed herself. And it's like, well, she was in fear, you were beating her to death, and we're not seeing any sort of remorse or empathy for that. We're just seeing Cassie being self-centered. It's about me. I was grossed out.
And yeah, then we left.
When you guys left, where'd you guys go to?
We went over to like Kroger or Publix to go get something to eat, and then we went back to the house. And we just kind of like chilled there. We were kind of like in and out of the house for a couple days. It was just me and him. I mean, I told my friends that my grandparents went on a vacation for like 2 weeks.
Let me ask you a question. You killed Grandma and Grandpa with Johnny. Johnny, you said, glues and what we know to be caulks the doors. Was that immediately after, or was that before people came over?
It was before people came over. I even poured bleach on them before he did that to the door.
And that was because it smelled and you were having people over.
We weren't intending to have any people over. We only had Sunshine and Alex come over just that one day because we were like, you know, it was only a couple days after, so we thought it was gonna be okay. Like, it didn't smell in the house.
She's offended that people are not understanding that it's perfectly plausible in her mind that to caulk the doors and to invite people over and to take Snapchat videos, all of this stuff makes sense to her. There's an element of fantasy life being played here, but the fantasy life is not her and Ryder being together and having a house. The fantasy is her not having any authority, imposing its will onto what she wants to do.
How come you guys didn't stay?
Well, because, so the reason why we stayed in town was because the plan was we were gonna get both of our families. But first we got my grandparents. Then that's why we went over to Johnny's house and we attacked his sister and her boyfriend because he wanted to kill his family. So that's like, we stayed in town for a couple days because, you know, we wanted to get some money, we wanted to get ready to leave.
Were you waiting on them to get home?
Yeah, that was Johnny's idea because then that's the reason why he asked me if I wanted to kill my grandparents because he wanted to already kill his family. He was like, let's be Bonnie and Clyde.
So that?
Yeah, I was like, okay.
In their dreams, they want to be Bonnie and Clyde. But these two, all they really want is to have the freedom and authority that their parents and grandparents are just trying to take away from them. She's just wanting to be reductive in how she's approaching her criminality. And because it's coming as a partnership, the element is Bonnie and Clyde, because there really isn't anything other that she could use.
Or what, you know, how are you feeling right now? I'm not in your shoes,
With
you know?
my grandparents?
Yeah.
I mean, I feel terrible. I mean, I feel like the worst person on the planet, but at the same time, it was kind of just like, I don't know. I mean, I feel heartbroken because, you know, like, there was so much stuff going on between me and my grandparents already. Like, I couldn't handle it anymore.
When you heard Johnny attacking Grandpa, you said you got a rush.
Yeah, like, you know, like, it's, you know, gonna happen. There's no going back. I had like this, like, kind of like this rush where I was like, okay, like, I'm ready to do this, you know? I gotta do this, you know? Like, I gotta do what I gotta do.
Compared to being in depth, these feelings are absolutely superficial, but even beyond being superficial, they're not her own. You know, they're her imagination of what she's supposed to feel like. And certainly she is very much focused on, as psychopaths tend to be, on herself and her own needs. There's no emotion behind it. She's sort of choosing the words that she kind of quickly in the moment is sort of figuring out, like, how am I, oh, they're asking me this for a reason. Oh, right, this is how I'm supposed to be feeling.
Did Johnny have a similar relationship with his family, or was his more of a beneficiary kind of thing? He wanted their money and...
Well, the way I saw their relationship was, his mom, you know, would get on him a lot, saying, you know, like, you're not doing anything with your life, and blah, blah, blah. When he had, like, he just got out of jail, he had 2 jobs, he was back in school.
For Cassie Bjorge and Johnny Ryder, I think this is a case where love does not conquer all. They don't care about what other people are trying to instill in them. They'll always buck control. They'll always view authority as being something negative. And then with these two in particular, I think we have an element of fire and ice. With Johnny Ryder being this fuel, this fire that really propels violence. And then we have this ice of Bjorge, where not that she's calculated, but that there's an element of coldness. There's an element of distantness. There's an element of she's willing to do whatever she wants to whomever she wants. And she will use her weapon, Johnny, however it is that she sees fit.
Okay, let me ask you this then. You literally have showed no emotion towards your grandparents.
It only seems that you're sorry you got caught, that you had people over after. You don't seem to be sorry that you killed your grandparents.
I am.
I'm just letting you know. I'm just letting you know.
So the most jarring thing about this whole interview with Bjorge is that never did she show any ounce of remorse.
Sheriff Barber's office.
Hi, my name is Valerie, and I work at a Dairy Queen. I'm the general manager out there. One of my employees did not show up for work this afternoon at 4 o'clock, which is totally uncharacteristic of her. I drove out by her house and went and knocked on the door, left her a note. She's not answering her phone, which is totally uncharacteristic.
This is Deputy Sullivan. Can I help you?
Yes, this is Valerie. I called in last night about Tina Herman being missing. I am out at her house now. I just went in her home because I'm so worried about her. There is blood everywhere.
2 women and 2 children are reported missing as Knox County Sheriff's Office say they found blood inside this home. While it's yet to be determined whose blood was found, investigators say Tina Herman has seemingly vanished, along with her 2 children, 13-year-old Sarah and 11-year-old Cody, along with a family friend, Stephanie Sprang.
A big development in this missing persons case over the weekend, though.
A 13-year-old girl who was also missing found alive yesterday.
Police found 13-year-old Sarah Maynard yesterday, bound and gagged in the basement of this man, 30-year-old Matthew Hoffman. After getting a tip, SWAT team members moved in, rescuing the teen. A massive search underway of nearby woods and lake to find Sarah's mother, Tina Herman, her brother, Cody, and family friend, Stephanie Sprang. They are still out there missing. As far as Sarah, she was taken to a hospital where we're told she's in good condition.
They enter Matthew Hoffman's home and they find something that's incredibly unusual. There are piles of leaves that go upwards of 3 feet high throughout the house. And most disturbingly and concerning, one of the 4 missing victims has now been found, thankfully alive, but she's been able to share quite a bit of information with law enforcement. She's talked about the fact that she's been repeatedly sexually abused and traumatized by Matthew Hoffman. No doubt law enforcement were preparing for a significantly violent human being, an impulsive human being, and also not being clear on how many victims, if any, are in Matthew Hoffman's custody and still alive.
We gotta get this cleared up. You know and I know. We need to get some closure here. Your mom said you was honest and cooperative. That's what she told him. You got a lot of people that are concerned and worried and missing people. We need to get that wrapped up, okay? Heart hurts. I don't understand sign language, man. Is that your heart? You're saying heart? Broken. Your heart's broken?
I think his communication style is his particular flavor of control. As psychopaths often do, he's trying to control the narrative and kind of tell his story. According to reports, we know that he had recently lost his job as a tree trimmer and that his girlfriend had broken up with him, at least in part, because he had gotten violent with her. I think his pantomiming the broken heart is definitely an indicator of being connected to this recent rejection. It speaks to him not really taking responsibility for the situation and more so emphasizing this was something that was done to me.
Allow him to go home. Stop trying to control everything. Stop trying to control everybody else.
Well, you know what? You want to play this little game, act like a hard ass, okay?
So, I think Matt's got some control issues. He likes to be in charge. He wants to be in command.
The detectives are frustrated. They want to find these victims. All that's doing is serving to inflate his sense of ego. He holds all of the authority in this situation. And that seems to actually be something that's further empowering him. It's keeping him going, and it's potentially serving as stamina for him.
I kind of look at it a little bit differently. I kind of look like this is a game to him. This whole thing's a game.
He has such stern convictions to his willingness to wanting to dominate over these detectives, to his willingness to say, you know, I'm in control of this, that supersedes even his impulsivity.
Every hour that goes by, they don't know if these victims need medical attention, if they're already dead. They are completely at the mercy of Matthew Hoffman.
Matt, you're gonna do the right thing. We're gonna get up and we're gonna step out of here. Okay? You're gonna do the right thing for us. Okay? I have faith in you. You're gonna do it. easy.
Why do you think that?
Because I must have done something bad. I wouldn't be here if I didn't.
Any individual, sort of psychopathic or not, it's sometimes in their best interest to leave open the idea that perhaps there was an aspect of mental illness at play here. He's clearly aware what people are suspecting him of, but it's like he's doing all he can to distance himself from every aspect of it.
So did you go to Quantico?
I did.
Was that just training?
Yeah, I was there about 4 months. That's what you have to graduate from to get in. Have you ever been there?
I bet your parents are proud. So you really didn't look up my history?
I didn't. Honestly, I would tell you.
And you really weren't doing your job very well.
He feels brazen and confident enough to challenge her credentials. He's disrespectful, and that's where you see his narcissism starting to come out. Now it starts to lend a little more weight to the fact that this selective mutism is all about power and control.
I came into it a little late, and I wanted to hear it from you.
So I did go out to Colorado after I graduated high school. And so I had the intent of going skiing. And it just wasn't enough. That's where I got into my first trouble. I did something really bad. I pieced it together. I figured it out. Then I went and turned myself in. That was my first prison time. Because I burned down a condo. I did burn down a condo.
Maybe the plan to go to Colorado and ski was that whatever lack of feeling or emptiness he was experiencing. This is somebody who's showing an escalating need for impulsive, thrill-seeking behavior. He needs more and more to get that high. So then he decides to turn his attention to thrill-seeking that's criminal behavior.
Thanks for being so nice. I'm not really sure what your angle is. You're from the FBI, you're not some counselor. So I don't really know what you're getting at. I don't really have anything to say. I have to just deal with it.
If we could talk about it, more memories would come, that kind of a fear? Or
I must have done something. I'm afraid that what they're saying is true and that I'm some sort of monster.
I don't think you're a monster at all.
I can't hurt people.
But people will forgive if you're honest and try to help as much as you can.
This is too big for forgiveness. There was a girl locked up in my house. How could I be forgiven?
How did you come to have Sarah at your house?
I heard her. I found her.
Oh, where'd you find her?
Tied up.
Tied up where?
My basement. I knew I had done something. What have I done?
So it's just kind of figuring out what happened at that point. And what you can say to give her peace, give yourself peace.
Peace.
Hoffman's showing us some displays of what we might traditionally think of as emotions. He sounds like he's crying, he's sniffling, His voice is shaky. But if we dig beneath that surface, what we can't ignore is that this is Hoffman manipulating every single one of them. And he's getting the detective to collude with this idea that, no, you're not a monster, you're misunderstood. He's not showing any concern for that 13-year-old victim.
Do you remember going to the store and getting the tarps?
I remember buying an orange shirt. It's what I got from Walmart. I think I'm just not consciously blocking it out.
Tina's friend that was there has 3 children. Oldest son, a daughter in the middle, and a younger son that's 9. They want to know where their mom is.
It's called closure.
Mm-hmm.
I agree that closure is good. I can't give it to him. I want to know what happened. But I'm afraid to know what happened. I really want to go back to my cell.
As soon as this FBI agent turns the conversation from being about Matthew's emotions and pushes him a bit about giving some information that could be useful in the investigation, he needs to literally leave the room, go back, think of his next batch of lies or how he's gonna handle it, and then essentially decide from there, okay, what am I gonna do next?
Hear any of our conversation?
No.
What Matthew wanted to do was, he said that this dream had revealed to him where the bodies were, and that he knew it all, and he's willing to give it up. Mm-hmm. What he wanted to do was, he wanted to write it to some lawyer he might obtain, and then have us go out on a trip to show him where it was, mm-hmm. and then try and escape and have us shoot him and kill him.
I just wanted to end.
That comes from holding all this inside.
To kill your shame. It was a dream. I just saw a really horrific scene in the garbage can. And just these past few days and all the stress, feeling that I'm involved, I was just trying to make a point today to end it.
Psychopaths tend to view things in terms of transactions because they don't have any other type of connections or emotions. So the only currency they really understand is, well, there's something in it for me. And so you see that on display right here, where he's finally willing to give up information, but only under the condition that he gets something that he wants.
You know, I know you think this is all some game, but I'm about the straightest guy I've ever known that does these types of interviews.
Okay.
Okay.
People will think I'm a monster. I'm a monster. If I've done what you guys said I've done, then I'm a monster.
I'm gonna interrupt for a second because I have some information now. They're telling me that they are pushing and, well, they're pushing, the prosecutors are pushing to have you come and have a hearing, and this is it. This is your last chance to talk to us, literally.
It's really not in my best interest to talk without a lawyer. It's your best interest.
That's gonna be the best thing for you, but we have to stop.
So why do you have to stop?
They're telling us that we have to stop.
You know.
The case is closed after a man admitted he murdered 3 people in Knox County.
The bodies of Tina Herman, her son Cody Maynard, and neighbor Stephanie Sprang were found inside a hollowed-out tree. This morning, Matthew Hoffman admitted to killing them and attacking a 13-year-old girl.
I did not plan for any of this to happen. I did not want to kill anyone. And I just tried to knock the first woman out so that I'd be able to escape. This was not working, and a second woman showed up, and things quickly spiraled out of control. It kept escalating, and I was panicking. I only chose to process the bodies to make their disposal easier. I instantly stabbed the boy. Hit Best a couple times. I saw the girl was not on the phone, and I could not bring myself to kill. I bound her hands, pillowcase over her head, and led her into the garage.
This letter that is wrought with details, but also minimizations and a lack of really willingness to take deep responsibility. Matthew Hoffman has complete detachment from the impact of that reality, the significance of his crimes, and you don't hear any deep remorse, any real remorse. You hear nothing but, I did what I had to do because the circumstances kept changing.
I tried to comfort her and told her everything would be fine. I made her a bed out of leaves, covered it with blankets, and placed her onto the bed. She liked the bed, and it was extremely comfy. I would not have hurt her. I could not hurt her.
What happened to Sarah, I don't even think he views as being that bad because he thinks he treated her very well. I think he even thinks that she saw some great things in him. That's a lot of times what narcissists believe. Well, they think highly of themselves, so why would somebody else not? So I think that he really bifurcated this crime into two elements. And in one way, he thinks he did really nothing wrong to Sarah. And for what he did to her family, well, so be it.
"30-year-old Matthew Hoffman entered the courtroom shackled and shoeless, facing a packed room of still mourning family members. And the 13-year-old victim, he let live. The judge listened and her relatives wept as the prosecutor read a letter the young girl wrote to her attacker.
All I was thinking about is if my family was okay and if I was going to be able to live. Especially when he was putting the ropes on me, I said, ow, that hurts. He said, I don't care if your arms and legs turn purple. I want you to know that you will never be forgiven by me. But I'm not scared of you, Matthew. I'm going to stand up for myself and live my life.
The rain started just after midnight, thin at first, then relentless, washing the streets of a quiet California suburb in 1998 as patrol lights bled red and blue across soaked pavement. A front door stood open. A television flickered to an empty room. Inside, silence pressed against the walls like a held breath. She was 27, a graduate student, last seen hours earlier buying groceries, smiling at a cashier who would later repeat the same sentence to reporters for years. She didn't seem afraid of anything. By dawn, that smile would be printed beneath two words that freeze communities in place: missing woman. By dusk, another phrase would follow: heavier, darker, final. And when the headlines faded, when candles burned down to wax puddles on the sidewalk, the case would earn a colder name: Cold Case. Two words that mean time has won. The house told a story investigators couldn't quite read. No broken windows. No force locks. A half-cut lemon drying on a kitchen board. Her purse still on the counter. Upstairs, the bedroom looked undisturbed, except for one detail officers would replay in their minds for decades: the bedspread pulled halfway to the floor, as if someone had grabbed and let go. Neighbors heard nothing but rain. A dog barked once, sharply, around 1:13 a.m., then stopped. The responding detective stood in that hallway and felt it immediately, that subtle wrongness that never shows up in photographs. This wasn't random chaos. This was deliberate, controlled. Someone had stepped into that house knowing exactly what they were doing. By morning, the yellow tape stretched across manicured lawns, and news vans lined the curb. The community called it unthinkable. She volunteered at the library. She jogged before sunrise. She called her mother every Sunday. Detectives moved fast, canvassing door to door, collecting fibers, fingerprints, cigarette butts from storm drains. They questioned classmates, ex-boyfriends, professors, neighbors who swore they saw a dark sedan circling the block. Every lead flared bright for a moment, then burned out. Within days, a body was found miles away off a service road, hidden behind scrub brush where the freeway roared loud enough to drown a scream. The brutality shocked even seasoned officers. The randomness terrified everyone else. The autopsy revealed precision. No signs of prolonged struggle. Minimal trace evidence. A single foreign DNA sample recovered from beneath her fingernails, partial, degraded, barely enough to log into a system that in 1998 was still more promise than power. Detectives fed it into the database and waited for a match that never came. They held press conferences, appealed for tips, chased anonymous calls that led to nowhere. The dark sedan was never identified. The barking dog never barked on command again. Weeks became months. Months became years. The file thickened, then gathered dust. Every anniversary reopened the wound. Her parents aged in front of cameras, holding the same photograph. Detectives retired. New detectives inherited boxes labeled with fading ink. They re-interviewed witnesses who had rehearsed their statements so many times they no longer trusted their own memories. A handyman who worked 3 streets over became a suspect, then was cleared. A drifter arrested in another state looked promising until timelines collapsed under scrutiny. The partial DNA sat in storage, a ghost in a freezer, waiting for a technology that did not yet exist. The town changed. Children who once rode bikes past the taped-off house grew up and moved away. The house itself sold twice. New paint covered old fear. But the name of the victim remained shorthand for danger, whispered to teenagers as curfews were enforced. Cold case. It became a warning, a cautionary tale, a symbol of something unfinished. Detectives would sometimes reopen the box late at night, flipping through crime scene photos that still felt immediate, still smelled faintly of rain in their imagination. They believed the answer was there, hidden in plain sight, taunting them. Then, 2 decades later, science caught up with silence. Genetic genealogy began rewriting the rules of investigation, turning family trees into roadmaps. The old sample was retested using methods unavailable in 1998, extracting more detail from what once seemed unusable. Technicians leaned over glowing screens as sequences assembled like pieces of a shattered mirror. A distant cousin appeared in a public database. Then another. A branching family tree stretched across states, narrowing slowly toward a single limb. Detectives who had long ago accepted retirement were called back to consult. The file was reopened, not as a memorial, but as a live wire. The name that surfaced was ordinary, almost disappointingly so. A man who had lived less than 15 miles from the victim in 1998. No violent record. Married. Employed. A neighbor, technically. Investigators built a quiet surveillance operation, collecting discarded DNA from a coffee cup tossed into a public trash can. The lab worked in silence. When the comparison came back, it was not ambiguous. It was not partial. It was a match so clear it felt like thunder cracking open a cloudless sky. The arrest happened on a Tuesday afternoon. No chase. No spectacle. Just handcuffs clicking shut in a parking lot while commuters walked past, unaware they were witnessing the end of a 20-year question. Reporters swarmed within hours. Stunning arrest, they called it. Community in shock. The suspect's family released statements of disbelief. Neighbors described him as quiet, helpful, invisible. The same words surfaced again and again: normal. Detectives held up the old photograph of the victim beside a new mugshot, time collapsing between them like a bridge finally completed. Interrogation rooms are built to contain emotion, but this one felt too small for the weight of 2 decades. Faced with the DNA evidence, the suspect's composure cracked, just slightly, a tremor in his voice when confronted with the science he never imagined would exist. He denied, then hesitated, then asked for a lawyer. The silence that followed was different from the silence in that rain-soaked house in 1998. This one felt like pressure releasing. For the family, closure was not a door slamming shut, but a window opening to complicated air. Relief tangled with grief. Justice delayed, but not denied, the headlines declared. Yet nothing could return the years stolen, the birthdays marked by absence, the holidays shaped around an empty chair. The community gathered again, this time not in fear, but in recognition that the monster had not been a stranger passing through. He had been there all along, walking the same sidewalks, shopping in the same stores, blending seamlessly into the background of ordinary life. And even as the courtroom lights dim and the evidence is cataloged, a final truth lingers in the quiet spaces between headlines. The rain from that night in 1998 is long gone, absorbed into earth and memory, but its echo remains. A cold case is never truly cold. It waits. It breathes beneath layers of time, beneath assumptions and forgotten leads, beneath the illusion that some questions stay buried. Sometimes the answer is patient. Sometimes justice moves at the speed of science. And sometimes, decades later, the knock on the door finally comes, not as a question, but as an ending that feels almost as shocking as the crime itself. The first crack in his carefully constructed normalcy did not come from a dramatic confession or a hidden trophy box buried beneath floorboards. It came from data, cold and indifferent, lines of code assembling a story he believed had dissolved with time. Detectives reconstructed his life in reverse, peeling back the decades like layers of old paint. In 1998, he was 29, working nights, living alone in a rented duplex less than a 20-minute drive from the victim's house. He had no record, no history of violence, no red flags that would have pushed his name to the top of any list. He existed in the margins of the original investigation, one of thousands of men who lived within a geographic radius drawn on a map and slowly forgotten as leads dried up. They mapped his movements the week of the murder. Employment records placed him off work the night she disappeared. Phone logs, preserved in dusty archives, showed no calls during the critical window between midnight and 3 a.m. Back then, that absence meant nothing. Now it felt like negative space in a photograph, an outline where something should have been. Detectives tracked down former coworkers who described him as quiet, reliable, forgettable. One remembered he had called in sick 2 days after the murder, citing a flu that no one else caught. Another recalled a small cut on his hand, brushed off as an accident with a kitchen knife. Tiny details, harmless alone, ominous in hindsight. The interrogation transcript would later read clinical, but inside that room the air pulsed. He sat rigid, hands folded, eyes fixed on the table as detectives laid out the timeline inch by inch. They described the rain, the open door, the lemon on the cutting board. They watched for a flicker, recognition, panic, anything. When they mentioned the DNA, his jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "Science doesn't bluff," one detective said quietly. "It doesn't forget." The sample recovered from beneath her fingernails had waited 20 years to say your name. Outside, cameras crowded the courthouse steps. The phrase 1998 cold case flashed across national broadcasts. Reporters unearthed yearbook photos, wedding announcements, neighborhood barbecues where he stood smiling beside people who now recoiled at the memory. His wife issued a brief statement asking for privacy. Friends described disbelief that bordered on outrage. This can't be real. He's not that person. But the evidence did not bend to emotion. Prosecutors began assembling a narrative that bridged 2 decades. They argued opportunity and proximity. They pointed to the genetic match, astronomically precise, eliminating any reasonable doubt of contamination or coincidence. They suggested he had seen her before, perhaps jogging in the early mornings, perhaps in a grocery store aisle. Maybe it began as a fixation, quiet and contained. Maybe that rainy night offered anonymity, streets washed clean, neighbors indoors. The theory formed like a storm system, calculated entry, swift control, relocation of the body to delay discovery. No forced entry suggested familiarity or deception. Did he knock? and ask to use a phone? Did he pose as someone in need? The exact method remained a shadow, but the outcome was carved in evidence. The defense countered with the passage of time. Memories fade, they argued. Evidence degrades. DNA explains contact, not context. They floated alternative scenarios: secondary transfer, laboratory error, and unknown accomplice. They reminded jurors that technology in 1998 was primitive compared to today. Could contamination have occurred during early testing? The prosecution responded with chain-of-custody logs preserved meticulously, technicians ready to testify to every sealed envelope, every refrigerated shelf, every digital timestamp added years later. The science was not a single thread, it was a braided rope. Meanwhile, detectives revisited the service road, where her body had been found. The scrub brush had grown thicker over the years, the freeway louder. Standing there again, one retired investigator felt the same chill he had felt in 1998. He remembered thinking the killer knew the area well, knew exactly where headlights from passing cars would not reach. Records showed the suspect had once worked a delivery route that used that very stretch of highway. At the time, it meant nothing. Now it felt like a breadcrumb glowing under a blacklight. Former neighbors from his old duplex were tracked down across state lines. One woman recalled hearing a car engine idle late that rainy night, longer than usual. Another remembered seeing him hosing down the interior of his vehicle days later, an unusual level of attention for someone who rarely washed it at all. None of these details had made it into the original file. They were memories dislodged only after his face appeared on television beside the words "stunning arrest." Memory is a strange accomplice. It hides until prompted, then floods without warning. As pretrial hearings unfolded, the community relived 1998 in sharp, uncomfortable flashes. Old newspaper clippings resurfaced online. Vigils were replayed in grainy footage. Her parents, now gray-haired, walked into court holding hands, their posture straighter than anyone expected. For them, the arrest did not erase the past, it reanimated it. They listened as prosecutors described the final moments of their daughter's life, details they had once begged to know and later wished they could forget. Closure, they realized, is not silence. It is confrontation. The suspect maintained his innocence publicly, but behind closed doors the weight of evidence pressed harder each day. Plea negotiations hovered like an unspoken threat. Accept responsibility, avoid the uncertainty of a jury, spare your family the spectacle. He hesitated. Pride, fear, denial. Whatever held him back also prolonged the agony for everyone watching. The trial date was set. Jury selection became a study in collective memory. Many potential jurors remembered the original headlines. Some had been children told not to play outside after dark. Others had followed the case casually over the years, absorbing its unresolved status as part of the town's identity. The judge instructed them to set aside emotion, to focus solely on evidence presented in court. But how do you ignore a ghost that has haunted your streets for 20 years? When testimony began, the courtroom fell into a rhythm both methodical and electric. Forensic experts explained genetic genealogy in painstaking detail, tracing how distant relatives in public databases allowed investigators to triangulate a suspect who had never submitted his DNA voluntarily. Charts filled with branching lines were projected onto screens, each branch narrowing toward him. The probability statistics sounded almost surreal, numbers so small they defied comprehension. It was not guesswork. It was mathematical inevitability. The defense cross-examined aggressively, probing lab procedures, questioning the ethics of genealogy searches, suggesting a slippery slope of privacy invasion. They argued that science, while powerful, is wielded by humans capable of error. But each attempt to fracture the DNA evidence seemed only to underscore its strength. The jurors watched, impassive, scribbling notes. Then came the emotional core, the testimony of the first officer on scene in 1998. His voice trembled as he described the open door, the flickering television, the unnatural stillness. He had carried that image for decades, he said, a snapshot he could never fully discard. When asked how it felt to see an arrest after so long, he paused. It feels like finishing a sentence I started 20 years ago. Outside the courthouse, the narrative hardened. This was no longer just a cold case. It was proof that time cannot shield the guilty forever. Advocacy groups cited it as a triumph of modern forensic science. Other families with unsolved cases watched closely, hope flickering where resignation once lived. Yet beneath the legal strategies and media soundbites lay a quieter question. What had he been thinking all those years? Did he follow coverage of the case? Did he attend community events where her name was spoken? Did he believe the partial DNA sample would remain forever incomplete, a fragment without a future? Investigators later discovered he had once commented to a coworker, years after the murder, about how some cases just disappear. At the time, it was idle conversation. Now it sounded like misplaced confidence. As the trial moved toward its climax, tension thickened. The prosecution delivered a closing argument that stitched together science and circumstance into a seamless narrative of guilt. They spoke of rain washing away footprints, but not DNA. They spoke of patience, the patience of investigators, of technology, of a family that refused to let a name fade into statistics. The defense urged caution, reminding jurors that reasonable doubt is the cornerstone of justice, that emotion must not override objectivity. When the jury retired to deliberate, the courthouse corridors emptied into a hush that felt heavier than any testimony. Hours stretched. Night fell. Reporters rehearsed live stand-ups under artificial lights. Inside the deliberation room, 12 strangers sifted through 2 decades of pain, evidence spread before them like pieces of a long-broken mirror. And in that suspended space between accusation and verdict, the town held its breath once more, just as it had on that rain-soaked night in 1998, waiting to see whether the word cold would finally be replaced with something warmer, something final. Or whether the silence that followed would reopen wounds thought to be closing, proving that even when a case is cracked, the echoes of what happened can never be fully contained. The verdict did not arrive with drama. It arrived with a slip of paper and a voice that barely trembled, yet when the word guilty landed in the courtroom, it detonated 28 years of silence in a single breath. No outburst. No cinematic collapse. Just a sharp inhale from the gallery, a muffled sob, and the faint scrape of a chair as the defendant's shoulders sank for the first time since his arrest. Outside, the news alert traveled faster than the rain ever had in 1998. California 1998 cold case cracked. Guilty. Justice after decades. The headlines felt triumphant. Inside that room, triumph felt complicated. He stared straight ahead as the jury was polled one by one, 12 confirmations sealing a fate he had once believed impossible. The DNA evidence had been the spine of the case, unbreakable, clinical, immune to charm or contradiction. In the end, it was not emotion that convinced the jurors. It was math, probability, the ruthless precision of genetic code aligning perfectly across decades. Science had done what memory could not. It had remembered. Sentencing would come later. For now, the focus shifted to impact. Her mother approached the podium slowly, hands steady despite the tremor in her voice. She spoke not of vengeance, but of absence. Birthdays marked by silence, a wedding dress never worn, grandchildren who would never exist. She described the night in 1998 when the phone rang and her life divided cleanly into before and after. The courtroom listened as if suspended in glass. The defendant did not turn around. Outside, former detectives gathered beneath courthouse steps, older now, grayer, some leaning on canes, others on each other. They had chased leads that dissolved, interviewed men who seemed promising until alibis hardened. They had boxed up evidence with a quiet resignation that maybe this one would never be solved. Now they stood in a cluster of dark suits, absorbing the improbable reality that they had outlived the silence. One of them admitted to reporters that he had kept a copy of her photograph in his desk drawer for 20 years. "You don't forget," he said. "You just wait." But even as the legal chapter closed, the psychological one deepened. Investigators began reconstructing not just the crime, but the years that followed. How does someone commit an act so violent and then return to routine? Records showed he bought a house in the early 2000s, attended neighborhood barbecues, filed taxes on time, laughed in family photographs. The ordinariness became its own horror. Evil had not looked monstrous. It had looked mundane. Reporters dug into his digital past, sparse, but revealing in fragments. Old forum posts about forensic technology, casual comments about crime documentaries, a bookmarked article from years ago discussing the rise of DNA databases. Had he been tracking the very science that would undo him? Friends were interviewed again, this time with a different lens. One remembered he disliked rainy nights, claimed they made him anxious. Another recalled an offhand remark about how people trust too easily. None of it was proof. All of it felt heavier now. The sentencing hearing drew an even larger crowd. Prosecutors argued for life without parole, emphasizing not just the brutality of the crime, but the calculated normalcy that followed. They spoke of the deliberate disposal of the body, the absence of remorse, the decades of freedom he enjoyed while a family lived in suspended grief. The defense asked for mercy, citing his lack of prior record, his age, his role as a father. The contrast was stark, two narratives colliding over the same man. When the judge delivered the sentence, life, the word echoed differently than guilty had. Guilty was about the past. Life was about the future, or the absence of one. He closed his eyes briefly, as if bracing against an invisible impact. There would be no rainy night anonymity in prison, no quiet blending into suburbia. The identity he had guarded for decades was now reduced to an inmate number. For the community, the conclusion felt both seismic and strangely quiet. There were no riots of celebration, no fireworks of closure, just a gradual easing of a tension that had coiled for nearly 3 decades. The house where it began had long since been remodeled, its walls repainted, its floors replaced. New owners stood awkwardly when reporters asked how it felt to live at the address that once dominated headlines. "It's just a house," they said. And maybe now it could be. Yet the service road remained unchanged. The scrub brush still bent in the wind from passing trucks. Detectives visited one last time, not for evidence, but for something closer to ritual. They stood where her body had been found and let the freeway noise wash over them. In 1998, it had felt like mockery, the world rushing past while tragedy lay hidden yards away. Now it felt like movement, relentless and indifferent, a reminder that time advances whether justice keeps pace or not. In interviews after the sentencing, the district attorney called the case a testament to perseverance and evolving science. Advocacy groups pointed to it as a beacon for other families waiting in the dark. Genetic genealogy, once controversial, was now heralded as transformative. But beneath policy debates and forensic diagrams lay a simpler truth. A young woman's life had been taken, and no verdict could restore it. Her parents returned home that evening to a house filled with sympathy cards. They placed the latest newspaper beside decades of clippings saved in a box, the original missing person notice, the discovery of her body, the anniversary articles labeled unsolved. Now there was a final headline to add. Cold case cracked. Stunning arrest. Guilty verdict. Words that once felt impossible were now ink on paper. And still, in the quiet hours after cameras packed away and microphones were lowered, a different feeling lingered. Justice had arrived, yes, but it had traveled a long road, and along that road life had continued without her. Friends had grown older. The world had shifted. Technology had leapt forward. The rain from that night had dried decades ago, yet its imprint remained embedded in memory, like a watermark. In prison intake, he was processed methodically, fingerprints scanned, photograph taken, personal belongings cataloged into plastic bins. The same system that had once failed to identify him now closed around him with mechanical certainty. There is a symmetry in that, investigators noted privately. The arc of the case bent slowly, almost imperceptibly, but it bent. Back in the town where it all began, streetlights flickered on as they always had. Teenagers walked home from late shifts. Dogs barked once, then settled. The word cold no longer attached itself to her name in headlines, but the story did not vanish. It transformed. From cautionary tale to testament, from open wound to scar. And somewhere between relief and remembrance, the community understood something profound. Justice delayed does not erase pain, but it disrupts the silence that pain feeds on. The silence that once protected a killer had been broken by molecules invisible to the naked eye, by cousins who never knew their uploaded DNA would unlock a decades-old secret, by detectives who refused to discard a box labeled 1998. The case had begun with rain and an open door. It ended in a courtroom with a single word spoken aloud. Yet the true ending was quieter than either, a gradual release of breath held for 28 years, a town learning how to say her name without the weight of uncertainty attached, and the undeniable realization that even when time tries to bury the truth, it leaves behind traces, waiting patiently for someone to look closely enough to find them. Long after the cameras left and the courtroom lights dimmed, the case refused to settle into history. It lingered in conversations at grocery store checkout lines, in the cautious glances of neighbors who had once waved to him across trimmed lawns, in the uneasy realization that for 28 years a convicted killer had lived among them undetected. The phrase California 1998 cold case no longer carried the sting of uncertainty, but it carried something else now, revelation. The monster had not come from the shadows. He had built a life in plain sight. Investigators, no longer bound by the urgency of trial strategy, began dissecting the timeline with forensic obsession. They reconstructed the hours before the murder in sharper detail than ever before. Surveillance footage from a gas station, long archived, was digitally enhanced with modern software. A grainy figure at a pump on the edge of town appeared minutes before the estimated time of abduction. The vehicle matched the model he owned in 1998. Back then, the footage had been too distorted to matter. Now it slotted into place like a long-misplaced puzzle piece. They re-examined his financial records from that year. A sudden cash withdrawal days after the crime. A receipt for industrial-strength cleaning solution purchased the following week. At the time, none of it raised alarms. Context transforms coincidence into pattern. Pattern becomes narrative. And narrative, when supported by DNA, becomes devastating. Former classmates of the victim came forward with memories they had once dismissed. A man lingering too long near the campus parking lot that spring. A car that seemed to idle whenever she jogged past a particular intersection. Memory is fragile, yes, but when anchored by proof, it gains new weight. Detectives were careful not to overreach, not to let hindsight create ghosts where none existed. Yet even their restraint could not erase the growing sense that this had not been spontaneous. It had been rehearsed in silence. Psychologists were consulted to understand the duality, the capacity to commit violence, and then resume routine. They described compartmentalization, the mind's ability to seal off atrocity from daily life. He had not spiraled after the crime. He had stabilized, married, advanced in his career, paid his mortgage. The absence of further violence both complicated and intensified the narrative. Was this his only crime? Or simply the only one that left behind evidence waiting for technology to evolve? Law enforcement quietly reopened missing persons files from neighboring counties in the late 1990s, scanning for similarities, rainy nights, isolated roads, partial forensic samples once deemed insufficient. Nothing definitive surfaced, but the question refused to dissolve. One solved cold case often casts light into others. Families with unsolved losses began calling the department, asking if their own fragments of DNA might someday speak. Meanwhile, the genealogy databases that helped identify him faced renewed scrutiny. Privacy advocates debated ethics on national platforms. Was it acceptable that distant relatives unknowingly had led police to him? Investigators answered with a simple counterpoint. Without that breakthrough, a killer would still be free. The case became a landmark example cited in conferences and law journals, a pivot point in the evolving relationship between technology and justice. Inside prison walls, his existence shrank to routine counts and concrete corridors. Appeals were filed, predictable and procedural. His attorneys argued constitutional concerns over genealogical tracing, challenged admissibility, questioned precedent. Each motion was met with firm opposition from prosecutors who had fortified their case with meticulous documentation. The conviction held. For the victim's family, life did not suddenly become whole. Grief, after nearly 3 decades, had calcified into something permanent. But uncertainty, that corrosive, sleepless question of who, had finally been extracted. Her father visited the cemetery more often in the months following sentencing. He spoke aloud updates he had once saved for courtroom testimony. "We know now," he would say quietly, as if reporting back. The town itself began to reclaim the narrative. A scholarship fund was established in her name, focused on forensic science students, a gesture both symbolic and defiant. At the dedication ceremony, speakers referenced not only her life but the science that eventually honored it. Rain threatened that afternoon, but never fell. The sky remained clear, almost theatrically so. Retired detectives were invited to speak at universities about the evolution of cold case work. They described filing cabinets that once defined the limits of investigation, contrasted with today's digital cross-referencing that spans continents in seconds. They warned against complacency. "Every unsolved case is a conversation with the future," one said. "You preserve evidence not just for today, but for the tools you don't have yet." In quieter moments, they admitted the emotional toll. For years, the case had lived in the back of their minds like a low-frequency hum. Holidays triggered memory. Rainstorms triggered memory. Even the smell of wet asphalt could pull them back to that hallway in 1998. Solving it did not erase those sensory imprints. It reframed them. Journalists produced long-form retrospectives, reconstructing the arc from crime scene to conviction. They interviewed jurors who described the weight of deliberation, the surreal experience of judging an act older than some of their own children. One juror confessed to double-checking the math of the DNA probability at home, needing to see the numbers align again before sleeping. They had understood the magnitude of their decision, not just for the defendant, but for the integrity of science in a courtroom. As months passed, the shock softened into reflection. The phrase "stunning arrest" faded from headlines, replaced by broader discussions about cold case reform units and funding for forensic preservation. Lawmakers cited the case when advocating budgets for backlog testing. What had once been a local tragedy evolved into a catalyst for systemic change. Yet beneath policy shifts and academic panels remained a singular, immutable truth. On a rain-soaked night in 1998, a door stood open, a television flickered, and a life ended violently. No technological triumph could romanticize that fact. The breakthrough did not make the crime less brutal, it made accountability unavoidable. In the end, the legacy of the case stretched beyond one conviction. It became a reminder that time is not the ally of the guilty, even when it feels like protection. Evidence, if preserved, is patient. Science advances. Databases expand. And somewhere in cold storage, in a sealed envelope marked with a date long past, answers wait for their moment. The town sleeps differently now. Not because danger has vanished, but because a question mark that hovered for decades has been replaced with a period. Streetlights still cast long shadows. Rain still falls without warning. But the story attached to those sensations has changed. It is no longer about a mystery without end. It is about persistence, of families, of investigators, of molecules too small to see yet powerful enough to outlast denial. And when new cases emerge, when fresh headlines declare another disappearance, another unsolved file, there is a subtle shift in tone. Cold does not mean forgotten. Cold does not mean forever. Somewhere, in a lab humming with quiet electricity, the future is already assembling the truth, waiting for the moment it will once again step forward and speak a name aloud. Years after the conviction, when the case had already been dissected in courtrooms, classrooms, and crime documentaries, a different layer began to surface, not about how he was caught, but about how he almost wasn't. The California 1998 cold case had been solved by a thread of preserved DNA, and a chain of custody that held firm across decades. But buried in archived memos were moments where the investigation could have quietly collapsed. In 2003, budget cuts nearly forced the destruction of older biological evidence deemed inactive. The sample from beneath her fingernails sat in a refrigerated locker, labeled with fading ink. A junior evidence technician flagged it for review, arguing that advancements in DNA sequencing were accelerating. The request was approved, reluctantly. The envelope remained sealed. That decision, minor at the time, would later become pivotal. Justice sometimes survives by inches. Detectives also revisited a missed interview from the original inquiry, a brief canvass at the duplex complex where he had lived. Records showed officers had knocked on his door in 1998 but received no answer. A neighbor mentioned he worked nights. With no probable cause and no visible connection to the victim, the lead dissolved. It was filed under contact attempted. The distance between attempted and completed stretched 20 years. As the case gained national attention post-conviction, other departments reached out with their own dormant files. Patterns were compared. Vehicle descriptions, geographic overlaps, behavioral consistencies. None yielded conclusive links, yet the exercise underscored a haunting possibility: how many offenders had blended into ordinary life before science matured enough to expose them. The solved case cast a harsh light on unsolved ones. True crime producers dramatized the arrest, focusing on the dramatic moment of DNA confirmation. But investigators knew the reality was quieter, almost anticlimactic: a lab report delivered via secure email, a series of stunned phone calls, a careful plan to collect a discarded coffee cup without alerting suspicion. There was no cinematic chase, only patience and procedure. The tension had unfolded in fluorescent-lit rooms, not on darkened streets. For the victim's family, public fascination reopened wounds in unexpected ways. Strangers wrote letters, some compassionate, others invasive. They asked for details the family had fought years to keep private. They speculated about motive, about suffering, about final words. Grief became public property once more. Closure, they learned, does not end curiosity. It redirects it. Meanwhile, law enforcement agencies expanded cold case units, citing the success of genetic genealogy. Training seminars referenced the 1998 investigation as a blueprint: preserve everything, digitize archives, revisit assumptions. Younger detectives listened to veterans describe the limitations of the late 90s: grainy surveillance, fragmented databases, slow cross-state communication. Today's tools seemed almost unfair by comparison. Yet even the most advanced technology still depended on a single factor: someone, decades earlier, choosing not to discard a piece of evidence. In prison interviews requested by journalists, he declined to speak about the crime. Through intermediaries, he maintained ambiguity, neither confessing nor fully denying. Silence became his final defense, a thin barrier against the overwhelming narrative built around him. Psychologists analyzing the case publicly debated motive: opportunistic violence, suppressed fixation, a fleeting assertion of control. Without confession, certainty remained incomplete. The facts of guilt were established. The internal calculus of why remained locked behind concrete walls. The service road, where her body had been found, gradually transformed. Development crept closer. A new warehouse rose within sight of the once isolated brush. Traffic increased. The landscape that had once provided concealment became ordinary industrial sprawl. Time did not preserve crime scenes. It repurposed them. Only memory marked the coordinates. On the 30th anniversary of her death, a small memorial plaque was installed near the local library where she had volunteered. It did not mention the killer. It did not reference the trial. It simply bore her name and the dates that framed her life. At the unveiling, speakers focused on who she had been rather than how she had died: her humor, her ambition, her plans for graduate research. The community, after decades of defining her by tragedy, began cautiously reclaiming her identity beyond it. Detectives who had worked the case spoke privately about the psychological phenomenon of delayed justice. For years, they had compartmentalized failure, convincing themselves that some cases simply resist resolution. When the DNA match arrived, it felt less like triumph and more like a reckoning, proof that the answer had existed all along, hidden not by complexity, but by technological infancy. The revelation was both validating and humbling. Academic journals analyzed the evidentiary strategy of the prosecution, praising its restraint. There had been no reliance on dramatic reenactments or speculative motive. The case stood on measurable probability and documented proximity. In an era where forensic methods sometimes face skepticism, this conviction reinforced confidence in properly applied genetic science. Yet the most enduring impact remained personal. Her mother once described standing in the rain years after the trial, letting it soak through her coat. For decades, rain had been synonymous with terror, the backdrop to her daughter's final night. Now it felt neutral again, simply weather. That shift, subtle and profound, marked a private milestone no headline could capture. The phrase "cold case cracked" eventually faded from trending feeds, replaced by newer tragedies, fresher mysteries. But within investigative circles, the 1998 file retained a quiet gravity. It served as a reminder that time alters evidence, but does not erase it, that patience paired with preservation can outlast even the most disciplined denial. In the end, the case did not conclude with applause or cinematic finality. It concluded with integration, a community folding the solved mystery into its collective history, no longer a bleeding question, but a resolved chapter. The open door, the flickering television, the rain-slicked pavement, these images remained, but they no longer floated untethered. They were anchored by accountability. And somewhere in an evidence vault, shelves still hold envelopes from other years, other nights, other unanswered questions. Each one waits with silent potential, a reminder that justice is often a delayed echo. The California 1998 cold case proved that echoes travel far, sometimes decades, before they return, clear, undeniable, and strong enough to finally break the silence. The California 1998 cold case had proven something unsettling and electrifying at the same time. The past was no longer as unreachable as it once seemed. Evidence was not aging into irrelevance. It was aging into opportunity. Within months, forensic labs reported a surge in requests to retest biological samples collected in the 1980s and 1990s. Dusty envelopes were reopened under sterile lights. Swabs once considered too degraded were fed into machines far more sensitive than their predecessors. Detectives who had long ago internalized defeat found themselves staring at screens with cautious hope. If one case could break open after 28 years, why not another? The original lead prosecutor was invited to speak before a statewide conference of district attorneys. She described the moment the genealogical match first appeared, a distant relative, third cousin once removed, living in another state, unaware that their curiosity about ancestry would ignite a criminal investigation. The room listened in silence as she explained the triangulation process, the narrowing of family trees, the painstaking elimination of branches until only one viable suspect remained. It wasn't luck, she emphasized. It was preservation. Preservation became the word repeated in briefing rooms like a mantra. Preserve the evidence. Preserve the files. Preserve the chain of custody. In 1998, no one could have predicted the forensic tools available in the 2020s. The detectives back then worked with what they had: partial profiles, limited databases, slow communication between agencies. They did not fail. They were simply early. The convicted man's appeals continued, predictable but determined. His attorneys challenged the admissibility of genealogical research, arguing that it skirted constitutional boundaries. Appellate courts reviewed transcripts line by line, scrutinizing warrants, verifying that each procedural step had been legally sound. The conviction held firm. Each denial reinforced a precedent that would shape future investigations. Meanwhile, reporters began uncovering near misses from the early years of the case. In 2001, an anonymous tipster had called a hotline claiming a coworker once confessed to harming a woman during a storm. The name provided was not his. Detectives investigated, found no corroboration, and closed the lead. The tipster was never identified. The revelation stirred public imagination. How many fragments of truth had brushed the investigation without attaching firmly enough to matter? The victim's father gave a rare, extended interview during this period. He spoke about endurance, about living with ambiguity longer than with certainty. When it was unsolved, he said, there was always that question before sleep. Now there isn't. Now it's just memory. His words traveled widely, quoted in articles examining the psychological toll of unresolved crime. Closure, he implied, is not happiness. It is the removal of a question mark that once loomed over every ordinary moment. In universities, criminology students dissected the case timeline. They analyzed the initial canvas radius, the suspect pool, the geographic profiling that had once placed him within statistical range, but without evidentiary support. They debated whether subtle behavioral cues could have surfaced earlier with modern profiling techniques. Yet most agreed on one conclusion. Without the DNA, the case likely would have remained suspended indefinitely. The town itself evolved in quieter ways. Neighborhood watch meetings, once fueled by fear after the murder, shifted tone. Discussions focused less on unknown predators and more on digital safety, forensic awareness, the permanence of data. Parents who had grown up under the shadow of the unsolved case now raised children in an era where technology promised vigilance, if not immunity. A documentary crew returned to film at the original crime scene, the house long renovated, the curb repaved. They captured slow, deliberate shots of rain hitting asphalt, an echo of that first night. But this time the imagery felt less like menace and more like context. The terror had been anchored. The narrative had direction. In prison, the man who once blended seamlessly into suburbia adapted to institutional routine. There were no interviews, no public apologies. Silence persisted. Some speculated that his refusal to confess outright stemmed from pride, others from legal strategy. Without his voice, the motive remained an unfinished thread. Experts suggested that some offenders derive power from withholding explanation, even after conviction. Control, in its final form. For detectives who had spent careers chasing shadows, the case altered their professional DNA. Younger officers were mentored with a new intensity. Document everything, veterans insisted. You're not just writing for today. You're writing for 20 years from now. Evidence rooms were audited. Digital backups were created. What once felt like bureaucratic diligence now felt like moral obligation. Other families of unsolved victims began contacting the department with renewed urgency, asking whether their own cases qualified for genealogical analysis. Some did. Some did not, lacking viable biological samples. Each conversation carried fragile hope. The 1998 conviction had become a beacon, but beacons illuminate without guaranteeing rescue. On the anniversary of the arrest, the district attorney's office released a brief statement acknowledging the investigators, lab technicians, and genealogists whose combined efforts had made the breakthrough possible. There was no fanfare, just recognition. The real victory, they emphasized, belonged to the victim whose name had once been preceded by the word missing, then unsolved, and finally nothing but itself. Rain fell again that evening, steady but unremarkable. Drivers adjusted their wipers and continued home. No sirens cut through the dark. No breaking news alerts vibrated across phones. The storm passed without incident, stripped of its former symbolism. And in that ordinariness lay the quiet triumph of the case. The weather had returned to weather. The streets to streets. The word cold no longer clung to her memory like frost. Instead, what remained was a testament. That time, while relentless, is not absolute, that silence can be fractured by molecules too small to see, and that somewhere in the space between past and present, justice can wait patiently, gathering strength, until the moment arrives to finally step forward and speak. The deeper investigators looked, the more unsettling the timeline became. Not because it changed the verdict, that was immovable, but because it exposed how close the truth had been to the surface all along. In 1998, geographic profiling software had quietly generated a probability map. A red zone pulsed over a cluster of streets less than 2 miles from the victim's home. His duplex sat just inside that boundary. At the time, the algorithm was experimental, one tool among many, and without physical evidence tying him to the scene, it meant nothing. Now, revisited with the certainty of DNA, it felt like an early whisper no one could yet translate. Detectives reconstructed his movements in the weeks leading up to the murder with microscopic focus. Credit card statements revealed he had shopped at the same grocery store as the victim on multiple occasions. Security footage from inside the store no longer existed, long erased by routine overwriting, but transaction logs placed them in the same building within days of each other. Coincidence, perhaps, or proximity tightening slowly into awareness. A former coworker, interviewed again decades later, remembered something that had once seemed trivial. He had asked unusually specific questions about forensic evidence during a casual conversation after a news segment aired about the killing. "They can't get much from skin cells, right?" he had said at the time, almost idly. In 1998, the comment barely registered. In hindsight, it sounded like reconnaissance. Psychological profilers reviewing the case suggested that offenders who stop after a single known crime often fall into 2 categories: those interrupted by circumstance, and those whose act fulfills a singular, dark compulsion that does not repeat. Without confession, no one could categorize him definitively. The absence of additional confirmed victims both relieved and unsettled investigators. Relief, because no further lives were tied to his guilt. Unease, because certainty remained just out of reach. The courtroom victory did not erase the blind spots of the original investigation. Internally, the department conducted a comprehensive review, not to assign blame, but to identify structural weaknesses. Communication between jurisdictions in 1998 had relied on fax machines and mailed reports. DNA databases were fragmented, incomplete.
Tips were logged by hand.
Today, integrated systems cross-reference names, vehicles, and genetic markers in seconds. The contrast was stark, almost disorienting. Young detectives studying the file were struck by the sheer volume of manual effort documented in those early binders: door-to-door interviews spanning hundreds of houses, handwritten timelines, maps marked with highlighter and pen. The case had not lacked diligence. It had lacked the final piece. And that piece had been sitting silently in a sealed envelope the entire time. Public fascination shifted subtly from the crime itself to the science that solved it. Panels on forensic genealogy filled auditoriums. Experts explained how distant relatives in public databases could narrow suspect pools from thousands to a handful. The California 1998 cold case became shorthand in those discussions, cited as proof of concept. Yet with every success story came ethical debate, questions of consent, privacy, unintended consequences. The solved case stood at the center of a larger cultural reckoning about data and identity. In private moments, some investigators admitted to a quiet anger, not at the process, but at the years lost. Had the technology existed sooner, could the family have been spared decades of uncertainty? Could the suspect have been stopped earlier from whatever darkness had led him to that rain-soaked night? The questions had no productive answers, but they surfaced nonetheless, sharp and uninvited. The victim's friends, now middle-aged, reunited for a small gathering on the anniversary of the verdict. They shared stories untouched by courtroom testimony, late-night study sessions, impulsive road trips, laughter that once filled dorm hallways. For years, those memories had been overshadowed by the brutality of her death. Now, with the perpetrator identified and imprisoned, the balance shifted slightly. They could speak her name without immediately invoking the crime. In prison, he adapted to anonymity of a different kind. No longer the quiet neighbor, he became just another inmate navigating rigid schedules and concrete walls. Appeals dwindled as higher courts declined to reopen settled questions. The legal battle that had once dominated headlines faded into procedural footnotes. Finality, at least in the judicial sense, settled in. Back at the department, a new cold case task force formed, inspired directly by the 1998 breakthrough. Shelves of unsolved homicides were digitized. Evidence was audited for viability. Families were contacted with cautious optimism. Some cases yielded nothing new. Others flickered with potential. Each file represented a suspended story waiting for science to catch up. The service road, now bordered by expanding development, saw increased traffic. Few drivers knew its history. The anonymity of the location mirrored the anonymity he had maintained for so long. Ordinary spaces had concealed extraordinary violence. That realization lingered in the collective consciousness, that danger does not always announce itself, that evil can occupy routine. Documentarians returned again, this time focusing less on the crime and more on the arc of justice. They interviewed the lab technician who had reprocessed the degraded sample using next-generation sequencing. She described the moment the fuller profile emerged on her screen, a clarity that felt almost surreal given the age of the evidence. It was like the past sharpened into focus, she said. The case also influenced legislative conversations about funding for forensic backlogs. Lawmakers cited it as evidence that investment in science yields tangible accountability. Grants were approved. Labs expanded. What began as one family's tragedy now subtly reshaped institutional priorities. And still, beneath progress and policy, the emotional residue remained. Rainstorms carried faint echoes for those who remembered 1998 vividly. The sound of late-night news alerts triggered reflexive tension. Trauma imprints deeply, even when justice eventually arrives. Yet there was a difference now, a grounding. The unknown had been replaced with a name, a face, a sentence. The question that once hovered over the town like a storm cloud had dissipated, leaving behind not clear skies exactly, but stable ones. The California 1998 cold case had traveled from horror to history, from unsolved to undeniable. It had exposed the limits of past technology and the power of future innovation. It had revealed how thin the line can be between ordinary life and concealed violence. And above all, it had demonstrated that time, relentless as it is, does not guarantee escape. Because somewhere, in laboratories humming quietly across the country, other envelopes wait. Other fragments of DNA rest in cold storage, patient and unyielding. And if this case proved anything, it is that silence has an expiration date, even if it takes decades for the clock to finally run out. By the time the 8th year passed since the conviction, the case had settled into something colder than headlines, but warmer than obscurity, legacy. The California 1998 cold case was no longer breaking news, no longer the subject of breathless live coverage. It had become institutional memory, cited in training manuals, referenced in grant proposals, studied in lecture halls where young forensic analysts leaned forward, absorbing every procedural detail. But beneath the academic framing, something more intimate continued to unfold. The lead detective from the original 1998 investigation, long retired, agreed to sit for a recorded oral history. His voice had softened with age, but when he described stepping into that house for the first time, the open door, the flicker of blue television light against an empty hallway, the cadence sharpened. He admitted that for years he replayed the scene in his mind, searching for what he might have missed. "We didn't miss him," he said finally. "We just couldn't see him yet." That distinction mattered. Because the truth was this: in 1998, the killer had not left behind a confession, a weapon with fingerprints, or a witness brave enough to point. He had left behind microscopic skin cells beneath a victim's fingernails, a biological protest, silent but persistent. Back then, it was a fragment. Today, it was a fingerprint louder than any eyewitness. The lab technician who reprocessed the evidence often described the moment the expanded DNA profile resolved on her screen. She had expected degradation. Instead, she found clarity. The genetic markers aligned cleanly, forming a profile robust enough to upload into genealogical comparison systems. She remembered staring at the data longer than necessary, aware that she might be looking at the beginning of the end for someone who believed himself untouchable. The genealogical search itself unfolded quietly, almost anticlimactically. Distant relatives appeared first, names scattered across states, connected by shared ancestry stretching back generations. Investigators built family trees branch by branch, eliminating lines that didn't fit age, geography, or sex. Weeks turned into months of methodical narrowing. And then, at the center of converging branches, stood a man who had once lived less than 2 miles from the victim. He had attended community events during the years the case remained unsolved. Photographs later revealed him in the background of a charity 5K run held in her memory. The image unsettled even seasoned detectives, the proximity not just in miles, but in narrative. He had inserted himself unknowingly into the margins of the story he created. Psychologists analyzing post-conviction behavior noted his continued refusal to provide motive. No confession detailing impulse or grievance. No dramatic explanation. Just procedural silence. For the public, that absence became its own obsession. People crave narrative symmetry, a reason that matches the horror. Instead, they were left with evidence and outcome, but no internal monologue. The victim's mother once said in an interview that she no longer needed his explanation. "I needed his name," she clarified. "I needed him to not be invisible." That statement traveled widely, quoted in think pieces about justice and closure. Visibility, in the end, was what DNA had forced upon him. Meanwhile, the ripple effect deepened. 2 additional cold cases in neighboring counties were reopened using similar genealogical methods. One yielded an arrest. The other remains under review. The 1998 case became proof of concept, cited whenever funding debates threatened forensic budgets. It was harder to argue against science when a decades-old killer sat behind bars because of it. Inside police departments, a cultural shift took hold. Detectives once skeptical of preserving seemingly insignificant biological traces began insisting on meticulous storage protocols. Evidence rooms were modernized. Digital backups multiplied. The philosophy was simple. Today's limitation could be tomorrow's breakthrough. Yet not every consequence was procedural. For residents who lived through the original terror, there was a subtle psychological recalibration. In 1998, fear had been diffuse, an unknown predator, possibly transient, possibly watching. After the conviction, fear condensed into something more specific, almost more disturbing. The predator had been ordinary. He had smiled at neighbors. He had carried groceries. He had attended block parties. That realization altered trust in ways no verdict could fully repair. Community forums were held not to relitigate the crime, but to discuss resilience. Experts spoke about vigilance without paranoia, about balancing awareness with normalcy. The town had spent nearly 3 decades under the weight of a question mark. Now it grappled with the period at the end of the sentence. On the 40th anniversary of her birth, a small ceremony was held at the university she once attended. A scholarship recipient spoke about pursuing forensic biology because of the case. She didn't get to finish her work, the student said, but her evidence finished his. The line lingered long after applause faded. In prison, his world remained compressed and predictable. Appeals exhausted. Media requests declined. The man who once relied on anonymity now existed in permanent identification. Inmate number, conviction code, sentence length. The system that failed to name him in 1998 now cataloged him with relentless precision. Investigators sometimes revisit old cases not because they expect new answers, but because they want to remember the feeling of uncertainty that once defined them. The 1998 file, thick and carefully preserved, now carries a final tab marked closed, convicted. But beneath that label lie decades of frustration, persistence, and incremental progress. Rain still falls on the streets where it began. Storm drains still fill and empty. Houses change owners. Trees grow taller. The physical world moves forward, indifferent to narrative arcs. Yet beneath asphalt and foundation, memory persists, not as open wound, but as scar tissue shaped by time. The California 1998 cold case no longer echoes as an unsolved mystery. It stands instead as a warning and a promise. A warning that normalcy can conceal violence. A promise that evidence, if protected, can outlive deception. And somewhere tonight, in another town, in another evidence locker, a sealed envelope waits. Its contents silent. Its potential enormous. Time may stretch, decades may pass, but the lesson remains carved in forensic history. Silence is temporary. Data remembers. And eventually, if preserved and pursued, the past will speak. Long after the conviction settled into legal permanence, the story began to shift again. Not backward into doubt, but outward into consequence. The California 1998 cold case had done more than identify a killer. It had redefined the timeline of accountability. Detectives across the country started asking a dangerous, hopeful question: how many others are still walking free because we simply haven't caught up yet? In forensic laboratories, the case was dissected frame by frame. Not the crime, the process. The preservation logs from 1998 were photocopied and circulated in training binders. The original evidence technician who sealed the fingernail scrapings was invited to speak to new recruits. She described labeling the envelope, double-checking the tape, signing her initials across the seam. At the time, it was routine. Now, it was history pivoting on adhesive and ink. There is something unsettling about knowing justice hinged on a strip of evidence smaller than a postage stamp. Something equally unsettling about knowing that without it, the narrative might have fossilized into permanent mystery. Cold case. Unsolved. A name etched into memory without a perpetrator attached. That alternate reality hovered like a ghost. What would the town look like if science had not advanced? What would her parents still be asking before sleep? As the years moved forward, the conviction became less about shock and more about structure. Policies changed quietly. Grants were expanded for long-term biological storage. States invested in genealogical databases with stricter oversight. Ethical boards were formed to examine the balance between privacy and public safety. The 1998 case was cited in legislative hearings as proof that delayed justice is still justice, but only if evidence survives. In the community where it all began, subtle transformations continued. The house where the abduction occurred was eventually renovated again, its facade modernized, its address no longer whispered with the same tension. New families moved in, aware of the history but not defined by it. Children played in yards that once felt shadowed. Time did not erase the past, but it diluted its immediacy. And yet, every few years, a documentary or podcast would resurrect the story for a new generation. The narration always began the same way: a rainy night in 1998, an open door, a young woman who never came home. The retellings emphasized the breakthrough, DNA, genealogy, the coffee cup discarded in public. But what lingered beneath the production value was a more fragile truth. The killer had believed in permanence. He had believed the evidence insufficient, the database incomplete, the science stalled. He had believed wrong. Inside prison, routine swallowed notoriety. The headlines that once carried his name faded into archived search results. Appeals dwindled to procedural formalities. Without public attention, his identity shrank to institutional records. There were no televised interviews, no dramatic confessions. The silence he once relied on now isolated him. The victim's family navigated a different evolution. For decades, grief had been tangled with uncertainty. Now it stood alone, heavy but defined. Anniversaries shifted in tone. Instead of pleas for information, they became commemorations. Instead of candlelight vigils demanding answers, they became gatherings celebrating memory. Pain remained, but it was no longer suspended in question. Detectives sometimes speak of case ghosts, investigations that linger even after closure. The 1998 file remained one of those. Not because guilt was in doubt, but because of the span of time it covered. Young officers who were children when the crime occurred now studied its paperwork as professional doctrine. The case connected generations within the department, those who began it and those who concluded it. There was also a sobering realization embedded in its success. If this case required nearly 3 decades and a technological leap to resolve, how many others still rest beyond current capability? Science moves forward relentlessly, but it always lags behind crime by a fraction. The gap narrows. It never disappears entirely. At academic symposiums, criminologists discuss the psychological dimension of delayed exposure. What does it do to a person to live 28 years believing they escaped? Did he ever feel safe? Did the rise of forensic documentaries in the 2000s tighten something in his chest? Did he follow news about genealogical breakthroughs with a flicker of private dread? There are no transcripts of those thoughts. Only speculation. The service road, once isolated, is now bordered by warehouses and steady traffic. Few drivers know that beneath layers of development lies a coordinate once marked by tragedy. Urban growth has a way of absorbing history into infrastructure. But for those who remember, the location remains fixed, not on maps, but in memory. The phrase "cold case cracked" no longer trends, but it endures in professional circles as shorthand for possibility. It represents patience weaponized by science. It represents evidence that outlived denial. It represents a family that refused to let a name fade into anonymity. And, perhaps most importantly, it represents the fragility of escape. Because the lesson embedded in the California 1998 cold case is not only that justice can be delayed, it is that time is no longer a reliable accomplice. The digital age does not forget the way the analog world once did. Databases expand. Algorithms refine. Genetic markers wait with silent persistence. On quiet nights, when rain falls over suburban streets much like it did decades ago, the town sleeps without the same edge of dread. The question mark that once hovered over every storm has been replaced by a hard-earned period. But the story does not dissolve entirely. It settles into the foundation, a reminder carved into collective memory. Somewhere in another evidence locker, another fragment rests in cold storage. Another case file gathers dust. Another family waits. And if history has proven anything, it is this: the silence surrounding those files is not infinite. It is temporary. It stretches, sometimes for decades, but it bends toward revelation. The 1998 cold case was once defined by what was missing: a suspect, a motive, a resolution. Now it is defined by what endured: a trace of DNA, a chain of custody, a refusal to discard the smallest piece of truth. Time passed. Technology caught up. The name was spoken, and the silence at last broke. There is a moment in every long unsolved investigation when belief quietly erodes. Not publicly, not officially, but internally. Detectives stop saying "when we solve it" and start saying "if." The California 1998 cold case reached that threshold sometime in the late 2000s. Leads had thinned to near abstraction. Witness memories had dulled. The DNA profile, partial and stubborn, sat in a database that returned nothing but absence. The file remained open, but hope had narrowed to a thread. What no one understood then was that the thread was enough. In the years before the genealogical breakthrough, the case existed in a strange limbo, too high-profile to forget, too stagnant to actively pursue. New detectives rotated into the unit and inherited binders thick with transcripts, photographs, and annotated maps. They studied the timeline like scripture. Midnight to 3 a.m. rainfall data, traffic flow patterns, the estimated time of death, the open front door, the half-cut lemon still fossilized in crime scene images. The ordinariness of those details haunted them more than brutality ever could. The victim's name became institutional memory within the department. It was invoked during training exercises about evidence preservation. It was referenced in cautionary discussions about tunnel vision. It became a symbol of unfinished business, a quiet weight carried by officers who had never met her but felt responsible nonetheless. When genealogical databases began expanding in the mid-2010s, a younger detective proposed reanalyzing the preserved sample using advanced sequencing. There was hesitation at first: budget constraints, procedural reviews, the risk of reawakening a case that might once again stall. But the envelope had been preserved precisely for this possibility. Approval was granted. The new analysis extracted more data than anyone expected. Where once there had been fragments, now there was a fuller genetic profile, robust enough to search beyond traditional law enforcement databases. When the first distant familial match appeared, it was almost anticlimactic. No sirens. No flashing alerts. Just a notification on a secure terminal indicating shared ancestry with someone who had voluntarily submitted their DNA for genealogical curiosity. From there, the process became both meticulous and surreal. Investigators built sprawling family trees stretching back generations, tracing marriages, births, relocations. Entire branches were eliminated due to geography or age. Slowly, the possibilities narrowed. The suspect's name surfaced not with dramatic music, but with statistical inevitability. He had lived inside the original geographic profile. He had worked nights. He had no criminal record. In 1998, he blended perfectly into the background noise of thousands of potential suspects. In 2026, he stood alone at the intersection of genetics and geography. Surveillance before the arrest was quiet, almost clinical. Detectives followed at a distance. They observed routines unchanged by suspicion: morning coffee, predictable commutes, lawn maintenance on weekends. The ordinariness unsettled them. They collected a discarded item containing his DNA, not through confrontation, but through patience. The lab comparison was swift. When confirmation arrived, it did not feel like triumph. It felt like gravity. The arrest itself, understated and procedural, belied the magnitude of the moment. Handcuffs clicked around wrists that had moved freely for nearly 3 decades. The community that once feared an unknown predator now faced the reality that he had attended the same supermarkets, driven the same streets, stood in line behind them without detection. In retrospect, investigators identified subtle behavioral shifts after the crime. A relocation to a slightly different neighborhood. A vehicle sold within a year. Minor changes that once seemed irrelevant. Without DNA, they remained irrelevant. With DNA, they formed context. The trial had established guilt beyond reasonable doubt. But beyond the legal closure, a more complex narrative lingered: how proximity and normalcy can camouflage violence. He had not been a drifter passing through. He had been rooted, stable, woven into the fabric of daily life. Experts later described the case as a hinge moment in forensic history, not because it was the first genealogical solve, but because of its symbolic weight, a nearly 3-decade gap bridged by preserved evidence and advancing science. It challenged the assumption that time inevitably favors the perpetrator. The victim's parents, reflecting years after sentencing, spoke less about the crime and more about endurance. They described the long stretch of birthdays marked by absence, the holidays where grief settled like an extra chair at the table. The conviction did not restore what was taken. It removed uncertainty, which they described as a different kind of torment entirely. Inside the department, the case file is no longer shelved among active investigations. It rests in the archive marked solved. Yet officers still pull it down periodically, not to search for new leads, but to remember the trajectory, from shock to stagnation to breakthrough. Rain still falls over California suburbs, much as it did in 1998. Storm drains overflow. Streetlights blur against wet asphalt. But there is a subtle difference in how those nights are felt. The fear once attached to them has been replaced with a sober awareness. Evidence endures. The man who once relied on anonymity now exists only within the rigid clarity of conviction records. His name, once unknown, is permanently affixed to a case that will outlive him. The silence he depended on has been permanently fractured. And perhaps that is the most enduring lesson of the California 1998 cold case, that justice does not expire. It may stall. It may recede into background noise. It may wait quietly inside a sealed envelope for decades. But as long as evidence is preserved and questions remain, the possibility of reckoning persists. Time passed. Technology advanced. The thread held. And in the end, what once seemed buried by years rose back to the surface, not through confession, not through chance, but through the patient, unyielding memory of DNA, proving that even the smallest trace can outlast the longest silence. In the end, the story does not conclude with the clang of a prison door or the final stamp on an appellate denial. It concludes in quieter places, in evidence rooms humming under fluorescent light, in living rooms where families sit without the old question mark hovering above them, in rainstorms that no longer trigger the same dread. The California 1998 cold case began with uncertainty so vast it felt permanent. A young woman gone. A house left open to the night. A community gripped by the realization that violence had slipped through its safest assumptions. For years, the narrative calcified into two unbearable words: unsolved murder. Detectives aged. Parents grieved. Files thickened. Leads evaporated. What changed the trajectory was not luck. It was endurance. The DNA beneath her fingernails, invisible to the naked eye, insignificant in volume, survived decades because someone followed protocol, because someone sealed an envelope correctly, because someone refused to discard biological evidence simply because it had not yet spoken. That fragment waited in cold storage, silent but intact, while the world outside evolved. When genealogical science matured enough to amplify that fragment into a voice, the past surged forward. Family trees were reconstructed from distant relatives who had never heard her name. Algorithms did what manpower alone could not. Geography and genetics intersected. And a man who believed himself insulated by time found the insulation stripped away by progress. The arrest stunned the community not because it was dramatic, but because it was ordinary. There was no fugitive chase across state lines. No altercation under flashing lights. Just the measured click of handcuffs and the abrupt collapse of anonymity. For 28 years, he had lived among neighbors who never suspected. He had relied on the assumption that partial evidence meant permanent doubt. He was wrong. The conviction delivered legal closure, but it also delivered something less visible: validation for every investigator who had ever preserved a sample without knowing whether it would matter. Validation for families who refused to let cases fade into archival obscurity. Validation for the idea that justice, though delayed, is not inherently denied. Yet even solved cases leave behind echoes. There are still unanswered questions about motive, about the internal calculus that led him from ordinary routine to irreversible violence. He has never provided the narrative people crave: no detailed confession, no articulated grievance. The why remains locked behind silence. But the who no longer is. And that distinction reshapes everything. The victim is remembered now not as the center of an unsolved mystery, but as a life interrupted, a student, a daughter, a friend whose name stands independently of the crime. Scholarships bear her identity. Memorial plaques carry her dates. Her story is told in classrooms not as caution alone, but as testament to persistence. For the detectives who began the investigation in 1998, the resolution arrived almost like a message from the future. They had done what they could with what they had. The rest required time, not passive time, but time paired with technological acceleration. When the breakthrough came, it felt less like surprise and more like fulfillment of a promise they had quietly made to themselves decades earlier. Rain still falls over the suburb where it began. It taps against rooftops, streaks across windshields, pools along curbs exactly as it did that night. But the symbolism has shifted. The storm is no longer the backdrop to a question without answer. It is simply weather again, stripped of its menace. Inside forensic labs across the country, technicians continue opening envelopes from other years, other tragedies. They handle swabs and slides with the awareness that today's limitations are temporary. Somewhere in those lockers are cases as old, as heavy, as once hopeless as this one was. The legacy of the California 1998 cold case is not only that a killer was identified. It is that time proved unreliable as a shield. That silence proved fragile. That a microscopic trace outlived denial, outlived fear, outlived the illusion of escape. For nearly 3 decades, the story hovered in suspended animation. A community learned to live with ambiguity. A family learned to endure unanswered questions. Investigators learned to carry unfinished work like a weight stitched into their uniforms. Then, in a laboratory far removed from the original rain-soaked street, a screen illuminated with data that bridged past and present. A name emerged. A door that had stood open in 1998 finally closed. Justice did not arrive loudly. It arrived precisely. And now, when the case is referenced in training sessions, in legislative hearings, in quiet conversations about perseverance, it carries a different tone. Not just shock, not just tragedy, but proof. Proof that evidence remembers. Proof that progress matters. Proof that, even after decades of silence, the truth can still rise, steady and undeniable, from the smallest surviving trace. The file is marked closed. The sentence is served in concrete and steel. The community breathes without the old uncertainty pressing against it. But the lesson endures, etched deeper than any headline. No matter how much time passes, no matter how ordinary a life appears, the past is patient. And eventually it speaks. If there is a final layer to the story, it does not belong to the courtroom or the laboratory. It belongs to time itself, the silent third character that hovered over every stage of the California 1998 cold case. Time as accomplice. Time as obstacle. Time as witness. For 28 years, time protected a lie. It softened memories. It eroded urgency. It turned headlines into archives and breaking news into background noise. The killer aged. His routine stabilized. Technology lagged just far enough behind him to create the illusion of safety. Each year that passed without arrest reinforced a dangerous belief that the worst had already happened, and nothing more would follow. But time was never loyal to him. While he built a life measured in promotions and mortgage payments, laboratories advanced in silence. Sequencing techniques sharpened. Databases expanded. What was once theoretical became operational. What was once partial became precise. The evidence did not decay into uselessness, it waited. That is the paradox at the center of this case. In 1998, detectives stood inside a rain-dampened hallway staring at a scene that felt impenetrable. There was no eyewitness pointing down the street. No security footage clear enough to name a face. Only fragments. Skin cells beneath fingernails. Fibers too generic to isolate. A vehicle seen indistinctly through storm-smeared windows. Fragments are easy to underestimate. For years, the DNA sample existed in limbo, entered into a database that returned no matches, sealed and shelved, referenced in periodic reviews that ended the same way, no hit. Yet every review meant the sample was still there, still cataloged, still preserved. When genealogical technology matured enough to interpret what had once been noise, the past reassembled itself with brutal clarity. A third cousin's curiosity about ancestry. A digital family tree branching backward through generations. Algorithms tracing bloodlines across counties and decades. And at the narrowing center of that expanding web, a man who once believed proximity and normalcy were protection. He never confessed publicly. He never offered motive. But science does not require narrative cooperation. It requires comparison. And comparison sealed his fate. The arrest did not just close a file. It altered the psychological contract between time and crime. For decades, offenders operated under a silent assumption. If enough years passed, if evidence degraded, if witnesses forgot, the probability of capture diminished into near zero. The California 1998 cold case shattered that assumption. It announced that evidence can age into strength rather than weakness. That silence has a shelf life. In the years since, departments across the country have audited their cold storage with new urgency. Swabs once labeled insufficient are retested. Old rape kits are re-examined. Unidentified remains are cross-checked against expanding genetic databases. The ripple effect continues outward, subtle but persistent. Families of other unsolved victims cite the case in letters to prosecutors. If they solve that one after nearly 30 years, don't stop looking at ours. Hope can be as contagious as fear. Yet beneath policy reform and forensic optimism, the human core of the story remains unchanged. A life ended violently, a family fractured, a community forced to confront vulnerability within its own borders. The difference now is not that tragedy has disappeared. It is that uncertainty has. Her parents no longer scan news updates for possible leads. They no longer wonder if the man responsible might pass them unknowingly on a sidewalk. They visit her grave without the old undercurrent of unfinished business. Grief remains, it always will, but it is no longer entangled with invisibility. Inside prison, the man who once relied on obscurity confronts the opposite reality. His name is permanently attached to a case that law students study, that forensic scientists reference, that legislators cite. He is no longer anonymous in a quiet suburb. He is a benchmark in the evolution of cold case investigation. There is a quiet symmetry in that transformation. The rain that once masked his movements now serves as atmospheric detail in retellings of his capture. The storm that symbolized chaos has been reframed as the beginning of a timeline that eventually bent toward accountability. And still, the most powerful element of this story remains invisible. DNA, microscopic, resilient, unfeeling, outlived denial. It endured in refrigeration units and data servers. It waited for the right moment, for the right technology, for the right alignment of curiosity and capability. It became the voice the victim could no longer use. That is the lasting resonance of the California 1998 cold case.
Not spectacle.
Not shock, but inevitability. Inevitability that evidence, if preserved, accumulates power over time. Inevitability that technological progress narrows the distance between crime and consequence. Inevitability that even the smallest trace can dismantle decades of quiet confidence. Somewhere tonight, in another jurisdiction, a detective closes a file marked unsolved and places it back on a shelf. Somewhere, a family blows out candles and whispers the same unanswered question they've carried for years. Somewhere, a sealed envelope rests in cold storage, labeled with a date that feels increasingly distant. If this case has taught anything, it is that distance is not disappearance. Time moves forward. Science advances. Data expands. And eventually, sometimes decades later, the silence fractures. The California 1998 cold case once stood as a symbol of fear suspended in uncertainty. Now it stands as proof that uncertainty has limits. Because no matter how long it takes, no matter how ordinary a life appears, no matter how quiet the years become, the past is never truly finished. It is waiting. In the years that followed, the case began to exist in two timelines at once. In one timeline, it remained frozen in 1998, rain on asphalt, a door left open, a flickering television casting blue light over a room that would never feel ordinary again. In that version, fear was immediate, raw, unprocessed. The killer was faceless. The future was a blank space filled with dread. In the other timeline, the one forged decades later, the story carried a different gravity. There was a name now, a conviction, a sentence measured not in speculation but in years of incarceration. The faceless had become documented. The unknown had become archived. What bridged those timelines was not confession. It was preservation. When experts analyze the California 1998 cold case today, they rarely begin with the arrest. They begin with the chain of custody. They begin with the evidence log, the storage temperature, the technician's initials across sealed tape. Because that is where the case truly survived, not in headlines, not in press conferences, but in procedural discipline. It is unsettling to realize how close the story came to ending differently. Had the sample degraded beyond recovery? Had budget cuts eliminated long-term storage? Had a mislabeled envelope slipped into clerical oblivion? The narrative would have remained permanently suspended. Instead, it waited. When genealogical mapping narrowed the field to a single individual, investigators experienced something almost surreal: the collapse of time. The man they had searched for in theory for nearly 3 decades had been living a life parallel to their pursuit. He had grown older as the file thickened. He had celebrated holidays as detectives revisited evidence. He had likely followed the occasional anniversary news story with private calculation. Did he feel safe? Or did every technological advancement chip quietly at that safety? The rise of consumer DNA kits, the surge of true crime documentaries, the national conversations about forensic genealogy, each represented a tightening circle. While the public viewed these developments as entertainment or curiosity, for him they may have signaled something else entirely: erosion. When the arrest finally came, it felt less like a dramatic twist and more like gravity asserting itself. The math was too precise. The match too definitive. There was no dramatic loophole to exploit. No ambiguity large enough to hide within. In prison, he entered a system built on permanence. The same permanence he once believed time had granted him now belonged to the state. His name entered databases of a different kind: correctional registries, appellate records, legal textbooks examining precedent. For the victim's family, the long arc of justice reshaped memory itself. Early grief had been chaotic, entangled with fear and uncertainty. Later grief, after conviction, became quieter, heavier, but clearer. They no longer carried the burden of the unknown man. They carried only the absence of their daughter. And absence, while devastating, is finite in shape. Uncertainty is infinite. Communities often define themselves by their tragedies. For years, the unsolved murder had lingered as an open wound in local identity. Parents invoked it when setting curfews. Neighbors referenced it in hushed tones during storms. The unknown predator became folklore, an invisible figure woven into cautionary tales. After the conviction, that folklore shifted. The predator had not been a transient phantom. He had been rooted, ordinary, embedded. That realization forced a different reckoning. Danger does not always arrive from elsewhere. Sometimes it grows quietly within familiar borders. Law enforcement agencies continue to cite the case as a landmark example of forensic patience. At conferences, slides display anonymized diagrams of family trees collapsing toward a single suspect. Analysts emphasize methodology over drama. The lesson is not theatrical. It is procedural. Preserve. Revisit. Retest. Wait. There is a discipline to cold case work that resists urgency. It requires belief in future tools, faith in incremental progress, a willingness to maintain evidence for technologies not yet invented. The 1998 case validated that philosophy in the most tangible way possible. Yet, even with conviction secured, something intangible lingers. The question of motive remains unanswered in his own words. Why her? Why that night? Why violence after what appeared to be an unremarkable life? Experts can theorize compulsion, opportunity, suppressed pathology, but without admission, the internal landscape remains sealed. Perhaps that is fitting, because the story was never truly about his psychology. It was about accountability. The rain that once symbolized chaos now feels almost symbolic of cleansing, not erasing the crime, but washing away the uncertainty that once defined it. Storms pass. Streets dry. Evidence remains. On the anniversary of the arrest, the department quietly reviewed other dormant files. New genealogical leads surfaced in separate investigations. The ripple continues outward, subtle but undeniable. Each solved case reinforces the same message. Time is no longer the sanctuary it once was for those who rely on its silence. Somewhere tonight, another offender may believe enough years have passed to guarantee safety. Somewhere, a family may believe answers are forever out of reach. Between those two assumptions lies a laboratory, a database, a preserved fragment waiting for the right moment. The California 1998 cold case traveled from terror to stagnation to revelation. It demonstrated that the smallest biological trace can outlast decades of denial. It proved that ordinary lives can conceal extraordinary crimes, but also that extraordinary patience can dismantle that concealment. The file now rests closed, its pages thick with chronology. The chain of custody intact from start to finish. The suspect identified, tried, and sentenced. the silence broken not by chance, but by inevitability. And in the quiet that follows resolution, one truth remains steady and unshaken. Time does not protect the guilty. It tests the endurance of evidence. And when evidence endures, the past does not fade. It returns. By the time the case entered its fourth decade, it no longer felt like a single story. It felt like a continuum, a living archive of how crime, memory, and science intersect across time. The California 1998 cold case had begun as a night of violence and confusion. It evolved into a symbol of frustration. It transformed into a landmark conviction. And now, it exists as a warning etched into the institutional DNA of modern investigation. There is something almost mathematical about the arc. In 1998, the equation lacked variables. No suspect, no match, no confession. Just a crime scene sealed in rain and a fragment of DNA too incomplete to identify its owner. Detectives could calculate probability, map geography, analyze behavior, but without a name, the equation would not resolve. Decades later, the missing variable appeared not through luck, but through accumulation. Accumulation of data, of technological precision, of public participation in genetic databases. The equation balanced itself. What remains haunting is how quietly the turning point occurred. No one in 1998 could have predicted that distant relatives, uploading DNA for curiosity about ancestry, would one day narrow a suspect pool from thousands to one. No one could have imagined that algorithms would outperform instinct, that a family tree would become more powerful than a lineup. And yet, here we are. The solved case reshaped internal culture within investigative units. Younger officers speak about cold cases differently now. Not as relics, not as permanent failures, but as deferred confrontations. There is a subtle shift in language from unsolved to pending advancement. The implication is clear. What cannot be solved today may simply require tomorrow. Evidence rooms reflect that philosophy. Climate control systems upgraded. Digital inventory tracking implemented. Biological samples cataloged with redundancy. Every envelope now carries an implicit promise. You may not speak now, but you will not be discarded. The victim's legacy, too, has shifted from tragedy to catalyst. Her name surfaces in forensic seminars as the case that reinforced the value of preservation. Students entering the field study the timeline not to dwell on horror, but to understand progression. Her story is no longer suspended in mystery, it is anchored in resolution. Meanwhile, society at large grapples with the broader implications. Genetic genealogy continues expanding. Privacy debates intensify. Where is the line between voluntary data sharing and investigative reach? The 1998 case often stands at the center of those debates, cited by advocates of accountability and scrutinized by defenders of civil liberty. It is both example and argument. But beyond legal theory, beyond policy reform, the emotional architecture of the story remains its core. A door left open in the rain. A family waiting by a silent phone. A community glancing over shoulders at night. And then, decades later, a laboratory confirmation that collapses uncertainty into fact. The man who once relied on the erosion of memory now exists within permanent record. His appeals exhausted. His anonymity dismantled. The life he built during those silent years now overshadowed by the crime he believed time had buried. There is no cinematic redemption in this ending. No grand revelation of motive. No tearful confession to provide narrative symmetry. There is simply consequence, measured, procedural, final. In quiet interviews, some investigators admit that solving the case did not bring elation. It brought stillness. A release of a tension they had carried so long it felt structural. They describe opening the old file after conviction and noticing how the paper had yellowed. The ink slightly faded. Yet the evidence inside had outlasted both. The service road where her body was found has been paved wider. Traffic flows steadily. Drivers unaware of the history pass through without pause. Urban expansion has softened the isolation that once made it an ideal dumping ground. Progress reshapes landscapes as surely as it reshapes investigations. And yet, if you stand there long enough during a storm, you can still hear echoes, not of fear, but of transformation. Because that location is no longer defined by concealment. It is defined by revelation. The California 1998 cold case stands now as a threshold marker in criminal justice history. It marks the era when time stopped being a dependable ally for those who counted on decay. It marks the shift from reactive investigation to data-driven inevitability. It marks the moment when the smallest preserved fragment proved stronger than decades of silence. Somewhere tonight, rain will fall again on another town. Another investigation will begin with fragments and uncertainty. Another family will enter the long corridor of waiting. In that waiting, there will be doubt about memory, about evidence, about whether answers can survive the years ahead. This case answers that doubt with quiet defiance. Yes, years will pass. Yes, technology will change. Yes, headlines will fade. But if evidence endures, if it is preserved, protected, respected, then silence is temporary. The file is closed. The sentence is fixed. The community has exhaled. Yet the story continues forward, not backward. Forward into laboratories where future analysts refine techniques not yet imagined. Forward into courtrooms where new precedents are tested. Forward into evidence lockers where envelopes wait with patient potential. The lesson carved by this case is not about fear. It is about persistence. Because the past does not dissolve. It accumulates. And one day, whether in 5 years or 50, it answers. Long after the verdict, after the cameras left and the headlines thinned into footnotes, the California 1998 cold case continued to breathe in subtler ways. Cases like this never truly go silent. They reverberate. In forensic labs, technicians reference it when training new analysts on degraded samples. They hold up anonymized charts showing how partial profiles once dismissed as insufficient can become decisive decades later. The message is clinical but powerful. Today's limitation is not tomorrow's boundary. In police academies, instructors recount the original missteps, not as blame, but as evolution. The door-to-door canvas that yielded nothing. The composite sketch that faded into obscurity. The reliance on databases too small to contain the answer. Each stage becomes a lesson in humility, in patience, in the necessity of revisiting what once seemed exhausted. But beyond institutions and procedure, the most profound aftermath lives inside human memory. For nearly 3 decades, the victim's name carried a question mark. People would lower their voices